Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the Hobby Hour. My name is Renee Cross. I'm the Senior Executive Director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Today, we have a group of distinguished political writers that focus on Texas and Texas politics and Texas government. And they will lead us through what has been happening in Austin for the 88th Texas Legislature and what we might be looking at in the coming months. So, before we get started, I do want to introduce everyone, and we'll start in alpha order. We'll start with James Barragan. James is a political reporter for the Texas Tribune. Previously, he worked at the Dallas Morning News and the Austin American Statesman. He has a degree in history from UCLA, and he's a native Californian, but we like him anyway. Okay. Next up is Kayla Harris. Kayla writes for the Hearst Publications and writes articles for both the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. Kayla has a degree in journalism and Spanish, and she also worked in the DC office of Hearst Publications. Gromer Jeffers is a political writer for the Dallas Morning News. He concentrates on pretty much everything government and politics, national, state, and local politics and government. He's followed at least 4 presidential campaigns closely. He's a Chicago native, and he is also a Howard University graduate. And previously, he did stints with the Kansas City Star and the Chicago Legend. And of course, writing for a Texas newspaper is his favorite gig, right, Gromer?
Yeah, that's right. And, along with hanging out with James,
Okay.
the bad boy from California.
And we also have our Houston guy. Andrew Schneider is a senior reporter for the Houston Public Media, which is the NPR affiliate in the Houston area. He heads the station's coverage of national, state, and local elections, as well as governmental activities, both in the Texas Legislature as well as in local government in the surrounding area of Houston. Andrew has 2 degrees from the University of Chicago and Duke University. So everyone, welcome, and let's get started. We were already joking that we probably could take one of these topics, one legislative issue, and fill up a whole hour, but we'll try not to do that. To start out, let's look at, I guess, very briefly, where we may be right now and where we think we will be in the coming weeks. As you know, the Texas Legislature came in with a $33 billion surplus, but the only requirement of a regular session in Texas is to pass a balanced budget bill. In the backdrop, of course, we have this amazing wealth of riches, but we also have some tensions going on. Imagine that in the Capitol. However, it's not between Republicans and Democrats necessarily. It is among Republicans. So, with that being said, we'll just casually go around with each person and talk a little bit about what you are watching most closely. So I guess I'll stay with the alpha order. And James, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the property taxes obviously is the really big one. That's the one that Lieutenant Governor Patrick and House Speaker Dade Phelan have been quarreling over, and they have not been shy about making their feelings known about what they think of the other chambers' movement on their proposals on property taxes. So I think that's really the big sticking point. Everybody has sort of committed to passing what they call the biggest tax cut in state history, even though I think some of us reporters might quarrel or quibble with that and whether it actually is. But they don't agree on how to get it done. And I think that's one of the main things that I'll be watching as we head into the end of the session, because this is where sort of the horse trading will begin. You know, how many of those anti-trans bills do you want to get passed for us to sort of bend to your will on property taxes? Or how many of these higher education, diversity, equity, and inclusion bills or tenure bills will you be willing to trade for the property tax bill? So those are the things that I'm sort of watching as we head into the final weeks here.
Okay. Kayla?
Yeah, pretty much echoing all of that. Property tax is huge, huge. Normally, I just cover the Senate, and so that's been all Dan Patrick has been talking about for a really long time now. He's just the property tax guy and has been really, really aggressive in his push this year for his particular plan about homestead exemptions and raising the homestead exemptions. So that'll be really interesting to see how aggressive he wants to be. He's already been really aggressive with his push for it, his version of the plan, but we'll kind of see how far he's willing to go and how much farther he's willing to go on that. Yeah, definitely watching a lot of the culture war bills. Even today in the House, we're seeing a lot of debate and talk about some of these anti-LGBTQ measures, about gender affirming care and stuff like that. So all of those things, yeah, just lots of fun debate on lots of different topics. Some really red meat issues, and then some real just like bread and butter issues in the legislature.
Okay. Grover?
Well, since James and Kayla took property taxes, I'm watching that as well. But school choice, and I'm curious to see if Abbott can get a win on a voucher program or voucher-like program, as he likes to call it. A plan doesn't seem to have the votes in the House. That coalition between urban and rural lawmakers against such things has held to this point. And, Abbott has put a lot of political capital in this. He's been on the road pushing the plan, but it doesn't look like at this point, it looks like it'll be difficult for it to pass. So I'm watching that. And like everybody else, sort of the culture war issues versus the bread and butter issues and the interplay there, and whether and how many of these controversial bills actually make it into law. This is Texas, so I assume quite a number will. And then how long will it take for them to actually get a property tax relief agreement? Maybe a special session, we'll see.
Or two.
Oh.
Okay, Andrew, what are you watching?
Well, like everyone else, I'm watching the property tax situation. But on top of that, I've been also watching a lot of the elections-related bills that are the not as much the focus this time around as they were in 2021, but they're kind of a big deal for us here in Harris County, mainly because a lot of the bills were written specifically with us in mind. There was a bill, SB 1750, that just passed the House Elections Committee yesterday and is heading for the floor, that would abolish the Harris County Elections Administrator's Office and hand responsibility for running elections back to the Harris County Clerk. Now, a lot of this is developing out of what was perceived by Republicans as a mismanaged series of elections here in Harris County. We actually did a 5-month investigation into the question of whether anything was deliberately done wrong. We concluded it was not. We also concluded that the whatever problems Harris County had in terms of its elections didn't likely affect the outcome of those elections. But regardless, the problems were have ginned up a lot of interest among Republicans, and so quite a few of the bills that our State Senator Betancourt offered up on this have either made it through the Senate and are already in the House or are likely to do so. And on top of that, I'm just now putting the finishing touches on a study that's going to be coming out tomorrow, taking a look at a lot of the preemption bills that are working through the legislature. Now, the legislature has dealt with preemption quite a bit over the last few sessions, largely at the insistence of Governor Abbott. And they dealt with issues ranging from preventing fracking bans to overriding ride sharing service regulations. But there's now a bill, HB 2127, that would basically prohibit local governments from regulating in a wide range of areas, 8 different areas of local government code, and it basically would take away a lot of the home rule powers of cities, as well as a lot of the self-governing powers of counties. And that one already passed the House. Its main backer in the Senate, Senator Brendan Creighton, is predicting that it will pass the Senate sometime in the next couple of weeks. So that's another one that I'm keeping a close eye on.
Okay. And again, we're very informal here. So if you guys want to comment on your colleagues' remarks, feel free to just jump in. Kayla's already mentioned this in short, but Lieutenant Governor Patrick has certainly been in the forefront of quite a bit of the news over this session. Early on, he identified 30 legislative priorities. And since then, the Senate has passed bills regarding these 30 priorities. However, it appears that House Speaker Dave Phelan does not necessarily agree with some of these bills. And Lieutenant Governor Patrick has basically said, the House needs to get going. So let's discuss some of those priority bills and which ones you think may end up passing, as well as maybe some of those that you don't think will pass. And what could be the repercussions, particularly in 2024, if those bills don't go into effect? Okay. Anybody just jump in.
Well, one of the ones that I was looking at fairly early on, and the number escapes me at the moment, was a bill that would basically ban tenure and at state universities. This is sort of an outgrowth of the fight over diversity, equity, and inclusion, and teaching of critical race theory. It goes hand in hand with it. Lieutenant Governor Patrick basically said fairly early last year, if I remember the details correctly, that he had a real problem with the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin passing a resolution in support of the teaching of critical race theory, and as a result, he wanted to make that a firing offense, and this is his way of going about it. It wound up passing the Senate. I think that this is probably one of those issues that could wind up sticking in the House for all the reasons that James mentioned before. It could wind up being used as a trading piece if things come down to the wire on property taxes.
Kayla can talk about this a little more, but there are some common areas that Phelan and Patrick agree on. School hardening is one of them. So I would expect some legislation related to that to be approved. Kayla can talk a little bit about that. But also reining in rogue DAs, that's another common priority with the chambers. How they do that, we'll see. But there could be some legislation to deal with some of the actions of DAs in like Dallas and Travis County related to, all sorts of criminal justice guidelines. So we'll just have to see about that. Library books. And then, property tax relief. They agree that there should be some sort of relief. It's just getting there that's the question. And but they disagree on more than they agree on, and that will be an interesting thing. And 30 agenda items, that's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah.
That's a lot.
I don't remember a list that long in any previous session. I don't know if you guys do.
Well, he's actually spoken about it. He's talked about how he would have his 20 priority bills and then how he grew it to 30. So, but I think that is something that, if we're going to just talk shop about it, I think it is a good thing to point out, Renee and Gromer, it is a lot of items. So to send over 30 priority bills and say, hey, every one of them has to pass. Well, like the House calendar also has like all kinds of limitations. They've got their 20 something priority bills that they want to pass. Plus they've got the deadlines to get House bills out of committee. Plus they got the deadlines to get House bills on second reading that's coming up. Like there is a lot of factors, and we can try to simplify it to just one chamber fighting the other, which a lot of it is. But I think realistically, 30 items as priorities makes it very, very difficult to get them all passed. And I think that's something that perhaps Speaker Phelan and his team have realized, that they can really use those as bargaining chips. And the other thing too is that, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has been the person coming out the strongest, getting all the headlines, because he's putting the pressure on the House and saying they're not moving fast enough, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. He's also the person saying, I'm going to force a special session if we don't get these incentives for the building of natural gas plants. I'm going to force a special session if some of these conservative priorities like school vouchers, like these trans bills don't get passed. So he's out front. He is being the aggressor in some of these things. And then one thing that we haven't spoken of yet is Governor Abbott and his role in mediating and sort of saying, hey, here's the plan that I want on property taxes. He really hasn't been out there in the open on a lot of these issues, except maybe school vouchers, Gromer.
Yeah, and James, real quickly, you just said how the Lieutenant Governor Patrick is talking about forcing special sessions.
Yes.
And it's Abbott is the only person with the power
Right.
to call one, and so he's talking to Abbott at the same time he's talking to Phelan about these things. He's flexing. It's all hard to do though in 140 days. It's just not designed for all this legislative activity, in my view. Especially if you have differing priorities and different viewpoints.
I just also add really quick that it's often said that the lieutenant governor is the most powerful person in Texas, but only during legislative session. And I think that is on full display right now, that just everything that we've talked about with Patrick just kind of flexing in every way that he can, that he has the power to call a special session if he wants it. On just to reiterate, the energy bills are huge for him. And they haven't really come up. We haven't had a ton of discussion about them here, but also just in general in the chambers. There hasn't been a ton of discussion about them in the House either. And he's like, if we don't do things to incentivize natural gas, then we're staying in this building like hell or high water. So I just think that's interesting to know.
Yeah, he said he doesn't have summer plans, right? And so I think that also goes to the point of like Gromer, I think the story you wrote a couple of days ago about the relationship with the big three and where that is. They're not having these Wednesday morning traditional breakfasts that we've had since the George W. Bush administration, at least. That sort of tells you where the relationship is and why there are so many differences and why there are so many divisions and why we are talking potentially, knock on wood, about a special session.
Well, that's a good point, James. So could someone kind of give our listeners an idea of how this may be a little bit different from previous sessions? I mean, we know there's always push and pull between the Senate and the House, but do you detect anything different this time?
It's funny. I was just about to ask, James and the others, who have been here perhaps a little longer than I have. My first session covering politics was the last session where Joe Strauss was the House Speaker. Mm-hmm. And if we want to talk about tensions between the House and the Senate, you only have to go back to the relationship between Patrick and Strauss, which was highly fraught. I mean, it's almost it's almost like the two chambers got sort of a breather during the last session prior to Phelan's taking office, and of course we all know how that ended. But I'm curious as to, historically, whether this is something that is more the norm than the exception. And is that something that you could speak to, James?
Or Gromer's been here longer. I got here that same session. I can speak to that. Gromer.
There's always division between the House and Senate. I think the bitterness is kind of always there. The spirit of wanting to win and competing agendas. I think what's different this time is you had a sense in previous sessions, in most previous sessions, that there was light at the end of the tunnel in some way, somehow they'll work things out. And there wasn't always a threat of a special session, although we've had a lot of them, even under Rick Perry. This one, though, I think there are two things going on. Not just competing agendas, but there are a lot of planes to land. The sheer volume of what they want to do and the culture war issues just makes it difficult to get done in 140 days, especially if you don't agree on all of them. You go back to 2019, you mentioned that was the bonding session, right? But Republicans were coming off an election year, and James, you remember this, you covered a lot of those House races where Democrats won 12 seats in the House, and Republicans were like, oh, okay, we got to get to business here and do a reset. So they went into that session and talked about issues like education funding, things like that, transportation, water, all sorts of issues that resonated with Texas voters. Everybody agreed they should deal with it. Now you have culture war plus what they want to do with property tax relief and how they want to spend this $33 billion in what to them is kind of play money, right? It's monopoly money in a lot of ways. Hate to say that, but they can spend a lot of money. And sometimes when you have that big of a deficit, not deficit, but surplus, you're going to fight over how to spend it.
What a great problem to have, don't y'all think?
Yeah. When you don't have any money, there are fewer fights, right?
That's true. Okay. Well, let's shift to Governor Abbott. I think we already mentioned, that Governor Abbott generally works behind the scenes during legislative sessions, and for the most part, this has not been an exception, except for his visits to various towns, particularly, small rural areas, to promote and help advocate for a school choice bill. As has already been mentioned, in order for that to fly, you're going to have to break up that, historical coalition that we've had on this issue, going back to even Speaker Strauss, Dan Huberty in the House, of Republicans and urban Democrats, some of them banding together to stop any of these efforts. So that being said, is Governor Abbott's jumping in on this issue? Do you think that will make a difference? Do you think that does have a shot of getting out of both the Senate and now the House? And what are the opponents saying? I mean, I guess particularly since this is such a big issue in the forefront, if you guys could kind of provide some background of how we got here, what it is that they actually are promoting, and again, the likelihood of passage. And anyone jump in.
Well, I think It's looking very difficult, as Gromer pointed out, in the House. The Senate's already moved it, but it's very difficult because of that coalition of urban Democrats and rural Republicans. But, it's still May. We've got about a month left. And because the governor is so invested in it, I do see him, I feel like he's probably working behind the scenes, working those rural Republicans, telling them, hey, remember how hard I worked for you during those elections? And also, he's probably not saying this, but they know this in the back of their mind that if they do not go along with his way, he has been known to oppose people who do not fall in line with the party line in Republican primaries. So he's probably working that. It's very difficult, I think, for that voucher, or I'm sorry, education savings account, whatever we're calling it these days, school choice, to get past the House. But I think it could be likely just because they want to make it happen for Governor Abbott. And it may be a very limited way that they get it passed, but I do see some hope there actually for supporters of these educational savings account, but perhaps in a much more limited way than other people would want it to be.
Yeah, the question there has to be, what will Abbott accept as a victory?
Yeah.
Sort if they go to because the plan as it is what I forgot to know. Is it 8,000? Is it?
Yes.
It's
It's
8,000. It's 8,000.
It's not a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
It's not an immediate impact, and I think what the opponents are worried about is once you start, you nibble at it, and then it becomes this big ambitious program, and then you're in a situation where your public schools are under threat. This is from the opponents, right? I think what Abbott and those guys underestimate is how powerful and how popular public schools and high schools are in these small towns and rural areas. And if they don't want it, and if you can't sell them on it, then I guess that's the problem right there. Is how do you get them to accept that you're not trying to make some sort of major change to a way of life that they hold dear? That's how I see it. But James is right. If the governor can get with the House opponents to the bills, the Republicans, and say, hey, let's do this, and they find some sort of compromise, then maybe he can walk away with some sort of victory. But what is that compromise? That's the question.
I don't think we can underestimate just how much community ID is linked to the public schools. As some of you know, I split my time between Houston and LaGrange, and I'm telling you, LaGrange leopards are a big thing in that little town. And I think it is so much more than just public school versus the option of going to a charter school. It really does encompass a lot more in the lives of those living in the rural areas.
So Friday Night Lights, that wasn't about a charter school or a private school, right?
That's right. And if that's going to fly somewhere, it may not be Texas. If you start talking about the end of Friday Night Lights. So
yeah, the other part of that too. Sorry, Kayla, I know you wanted to jump in here, but one thing I'll say, just because you were talking about the community ID, Renee, is that it's also particularly in these rural districts where there's this opposition, they are the main employers in a lot of these places. Like generations of kids have gone to these schools. The same teachers have taught generations of the same families. It's not these like woke mobs, quote unquote, that they're saying in the urban districts, teaching your kids about CRT. They ain't teaching that stuff in rural Texas. They're teaching regular rural Texas stuff. And so when the governor says, we need to get back to teaching the basics, well, that's the basics that they're teaching already. So that sort of woke mob attack doesn't work down there. And there is that community ID that you're talking about is very, very strong. And that's why it's been so hard to overcome, not to mention the fact that in a lot of these places, there just aren't a whole lot of private options, particularly if you don't include homeschooling, which I don't think the bill does. It gets even tougher for them to like make a path towards passage. So that's what the supporters of education savings account are facing.
The only thing I wanted to add there was that the House passed a largely symbolic amendment a couple of weeks ago, basically saying we're not going to use public dollars for private schools, which of course puts the fate of this bill in question. But that amendment is offered every year for the most part. And this year, I think it passed with like 86 or something votes. Don't quote me on that. But in the past, it has passed with like 115 votes. And so even just that that change to so many people have changed their mind on this and have opened their minds on this, that I think that is interesting, and that it shows there is some room for movement on this. And again, Abbott can't put this much effort and capital into something like this and not walk away with something.
I think you're exactly right. And as Gromer said as well, is that, he may not see the exact bill come out, but there will more than likely be something, again, inching in that direction. So let's jump now to culture wars. We mentioned that briefly as far as, besides property taxes and school choice, we've certainly seen a number of bills that are in the cultural war arena. So what have you guys been watching specifically in this area, and just your general thoughts?
Well, pretty wide ranging things. I think one of the things that that came up recently here in Houston, which we were reporting on at my station, is the efforts to make drag shows illegal, or at any rate to regulate them to the point where they're extremely under the thumb of government. We had a situation recently where a number of there was a production of James the Giant Peach, and one of the female roles was played by a male actor. A parent complained, and quite a few different school tour groups pulled out of going to see the show. I think that the efforts by the state legislature on this front fall in line with what we've seen from a number of other strongly Republican states. Florida comes to mind, and that's something that my station is going to be doing some more reporting on going forward. I was just speaking with my colleague Dominic Anthony Walsh, who's our education reporter. He's got a feature on that coming up.
Okay. Anyone else?
Just to go back to the LGBTQ bills, the one on gender affirming care for minors, and also there's another bill that would target gender affirming care for all transgender Texans, but it has to do with medical liabilities and financial liabilities for medical providers. Those, though, are anytime you're dealing with someone's health care and their access to health care, that's a huge deal. That's something that really tangibly affects people. That's something that could force people to leave the state if passed. And these kinds of bills about LGBTQ Texans haven't really advanced in the past. They've passed the Senate, or they've gained some traction, but they haven't been signed into law. And so we see this national trend targeting gender affirming care and trying to stop children from having access to things like puberty blockers that major medical associations support and say are really helpful for these children when they may be dealing with gender dysphoria or just mental health challenges that are related to their gender identity. And so that is something to really closely watch. There was some debate in the Senate when they were debating that bill for children about grandfathering in children who are already taking those medications so that they wouldn't have to just stop. And, even the authors of the bill in both chambers were saying, we don't know what will happen to them if we take them off these meds right away. So maybe we should exercise some caution. But then there was some backlash from farther right members of the party who said we don't want that at all. And so now that's been taken out of the bill. I'm ranting too long about this, but I just think that that's a really interesting one to watch because it has such a tangible effect on so many people, and again, could cause them to leave the state.
I agree. I a lot of these bills, or some of them, are kind of symbolic in nature. This one, those proposals that Kayla just talked about, really impact healthcare and the well-being of Texas residents, some Texas residents impacted by them. So it'll be interesting to see what the House does in this respect. And James, you remember Strauss was real careful treading into these transgender issues or bills.
I'm not going to have a kid's foot on my hands is what I remember.
Exactly. And so we'll see. The problem here is that these things become like popular all across the country with ultra conservative activists, and they demand action on it, whether it's in Texas, Florida, or other places. And so the question is, how much pressure will these Republican lawmakers in the House have to pass some of these bills that they otherwise don't want to pass or don't want to deal with, for fear that they will have an opponent in the primary or face some voter backlash? Because I can tell you the consultants and the potential opponents are looking at this. Dan Patrick has already sort of, said that, they're taking names. I don't know that he'll get involved in House races, but you know what I mean, that people are watching to see what these Republican lawmakers do. And if they don't do what they perceive as the right thing on these issues, they may primary them, and that's always the backdrop with with these sort of issues.
Well, and it's interesting too because with that bill you're talking about, Kayla, about sort of grandfathering in kids who were already taking some kind of medication or treatment. The House author has said he wants to keep that in there. And so it will be interesting to see what happens. Is that a poison pill when they send it back to the Senate and it has that in there? Or will they come really strongly after Representative Oliverson in a primary? It would be strange for the lieutenant governor, the leader of the Senate, to try to get involved in House races. But, as we reported last year, he was the one behind the big Trump push on forcing Speaker Phelan to move on election bills, trying to recruit a primary candidate against him. So that is the fear, as Gromer has said. One other interesting thing for me is that Kayla pointed out on the school choice, school voucher bill, the number of yeses on it was far less than what it's previously been in the hundreds. Now it's 86. I think you're right, Kayla. But one thing to note there is that the House has gotten more and more conservative as the Republicans who hold the line on some of these issues get primaried. That is reflected, I think, in what we're talking about, the kinds of bills that get to the floor. But I think it also says something to the public that even though you're hearing all these loud voices saying, hey, here's what the people want, if these bills are still not passing, I think that's the real reflection of what the people want. The representatives and the senators know their districts, So just an interesting point there. Even as we've gotten more conservative in the House, those bills still struggle to pass. So it's much more complicated, I think, than people might want to make it out to be. Also, it's gotten so conservative that we haven't even talked about immigration yet, and there's a huge immigration bill out there.
That's another show.
But and James, one of the things that a good speaker will do is protect his or her. Well, there hasn't been a woman yet, but protect members from difficult votes like that by stopping legislation from getting on the floor. And I think you'll see Phelan doing a lot of that, trying to protect his members where they can go in their districts and say, hey, it didn't get out of committee or whatever the reason is. And that's where the friction between Phil and Patrick, that's another source of it.
Yeah.
Because Patrick knows the game, and he knows that Phil wanted some of these things to get to the floor that they would.
Let's shift gears, and I'm going to throw this question first to Kayla because I know she's working on this. We're approaching the first anniversary of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary in Uvalde. Kayla, are there any substantial gun safety laws in the works, generally speaking, but certainly in terms of school safety?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is that a lot of the Uvalde families after the shooting have been calling for some very stringent gun safety measures. And their primary ask is raising the age to purchase an assault style weapon from 18 to 21. And that bill, as we know, has gotten a hearing in the House, but the committee has so far declined to take a vote on it, which is really what the families have been asking for. They're in Austin today asking for a vote on that bill, even if it doesn't pass, though they believe it does have the votes to pass the committee. After it wouldn't even pass that, it probably wouldn't pass calendars, it wouldn't pass the House, and it definitely wouldn't pass the Senate, even if it advanced through that committee. But for them, it's a largely symbolic thing of saying, we're having some action after our children's lives were taken. They've asked for some other gun safety bills too that haven't gotten any traction this session. Red flag laws, which basically allow a judge to say to take guns away from people deemed a danger to themselves or others. Safe storage laws, some of which have actually gained a little bit of traction. The primary response to the shooting so far has been some general school safety bills. So that's SB 11 in the Senate and HB 3 in the House. Mostly just giving some extra money to schools to harden their facilities, to increase school security, arm teachers or other school employees, put more security guards, armed security guards on campuses, things like that. We're giving some more money to mental health services, especially in rural areas, which is a huge part of the response, especially for Republicans. So there's definitely a response to the shooting, but it's not on guns. Republicans are pretty much opposed to anything that would that they believe would infringe on the Second Amendment.
Any other comments on gun safety? Okay. James, I'm going to direct this one to you since you've already mentioned immigration. Governor Abbott has made securing the southern border a priority. We've seen a lot of money going towards those efforts, not just this session, but in the last 2 years. At the same time, Speaker Phelan has declared the Border Protection Unit, which is a civilian force with law enforcement experience, one of his legislative priorities. What border security measures stand out to you, and do you think they are going to pass, and what could this result in?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent more than $4 billion on border security funding over the last 2 years. We definitely underestimated how much that would cost because the legislature had to then go and give increasing $500 million, batches of funding after that. So we're at $4 billion right now. We've still got thousands of National Guard soldiers, troops, because there's airmen as well, on the border, trying to implement some of these policies that the governor has pushed for. But the main thing around this session, I think, is the Border Protection Unit. There are other things like trying to create a felony offense for trespassing, and that legally, I think the concern from immigration rights activists and immigration lawyers is that would make it very difficult for that person then to be able to have citizenship in the country or to try to seek asylum. It makes it much more difficult because now you have a felony on your record. So that's one big push, which is a priority for Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and there's a similar thing in the House. So there are some things where they're aligned. The big thing, however, is the Border Protection Unit, and that would basically deputize people to become our own sort of state border patrol. But there are questions and concerns about, what kinds of trainings they would have, what authority they would have, how that would mesh with, the traditional purview of the federal government over immigration. And I don't think it's going too far to say that this is clearly an effort by Texas lawmakers who, the leadership in the state is Republican, by Texas Republicans, to challenge the Arizona court cases on immigration so that this could possibly go up to the Supreme Court, where I think they believe they have a friendly venue to allow the state to get more and more into immigration enforcement. So there's, I think, a plethora of concerns on this border protection unit. And right now it has passed committee. It's going through calendars. There are, only a week and a half left for House bills to pass. But, bills are never dead, as we all know on this call. They can always get amended. They can always get, tacked onto other bills. But, there's a short time for that to get done as a House bill. And I think probably Democrats are really looking to really stretch out these long days, get everybody tired, get as few bills passed in the next couple of days so that they can play some defense and strategize to perhaps get in the way of that border protection unit bill.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about abortion. Of course, it has not been the issue this session compared to last session. Texas arguably has the strongest abortion restrictions in the nation. However, we still have numerous bills that have been filed in an attempt to further those restrictions. Are there any abortion-related bills that you feel have a chance of passing? And what do you think could be the repercussions?
Well, go ahead, Kayla.
I was just going to say the sentiment that I'm getting by and large is that nobody really wants to touch this issue. And by nobody, I mean Republicans, the majority in both chambers. Abortion was one of, if not the biggest issue to come out of the 2021 session. After that, Republicans were really happy with the laws that they passed. They were very happy when Roe v. Wade was overturned. The only time we kind of saw a little bit of a shift in narrative was during election season, when some Republicans indicated that they could be open to some new exceptions in the law for rape and incest. Or Governor Abbott, for example, had expressed interest in revisiting the provision that would allow an exception when the mother's life is at risk. As we know, there have been some concerns that people have tried to seek abortions when their pregnancies have been dangerous, but doctors have been afraid to perform those abortions for fear of the repercussions from the bill, leaving the women basically in really dangerous positions and forcing them to get worse before they can get better. Since then, though, and since Republicans solidified their majority, everyone won re-election, it hasn't really come up. Democrats have, of course, tried to revisit this issue, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. I also don't think Republicans want to visit it from the other side. There have been a couple of bills filed, as you mentioned, that would make the laws a little bit stricter or extended in some way. And please feel free, anybody, to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think those have advanced either.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity here to do some good, because Republicans, Patrick wants what he calls basically expanding alternatives to abortion, but where there may be some compromise and where you can get both parties on board is doing something to deal with the maternal mortality crisis in Texas, and giving more funding to try to stop that, and more mental health funding and things like that, more money for healthcare, adoptions, all of that sort of stuff. And maybe that you can find some common ground there. But I agree with Kayla. No one has an appetite, even though this is Texas, right? No one has a strong appetite for the other stuff this session. We'll just have to see on it. Sometimes you got to watch the very end. But I do believe there's an opportunity for some Republicans and Democrats to get together and do something about healthcare issues related to pregnancies.
Yeah, I think particularly in the aftermath of the 2022 elections, where Republicans saw so many of their hopes for much stronger showing dashed as a result of the backlash to the repealing of Roe versus Wade. There just isn't much of an appetite to try and push that envelope further here in Texas.
I think that's true because we saw states like Michigan or Wisconsin, there was definitely a backlash to the threat of further restrictions in light of the Dobbs decision. Now to shift gears very quickly again, Andrew, you mentioned election bills in your opening. Let's talk very briefly about some of the election bills, but let me throw out a few statistics to you, and tell me whether you think these things will pass or not. Earlier this year at the Hobby School, we did a statewide survey on a number of legislative issues. Election bills, of course, were included. We found that 71% of Texans support making the penalty for the crime of illegal voting a felony. Votes, will this pass or no?
I'm actually kind of surprised that it hasn't gotten further than it has already. I mean, it went through the Senate very quickly on a largely party line vote. The sentiment in the House, I think, is very much the same as it was 2 years ago, where it came close to passing. Where basically it was at the it was basically a last minute addition by the House to the main election bill that passed in 2021 that changed voting from a felony as it had been to a Class A misdemeanor. And I don't think there's a whole lot of appetite in the House to revisit that. But, I think, again, this is one of those issues that could wind up getting tacked onto a bill towards the end of the session, if not passed directly.
Well, it is interesting that there seems to be such widespread support for making it a felony again. Obviously, if you have 71% of registered voters in Texas, that should include some Democrats that are supporting this change back. But as you noted, this doesn't seem to be racing through to the finish line.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that is not the only feature of the Senate bill. There were two aspects to SB 2. One of them was changing illegal voting to a felony again. The other of which was to change the standard under which guilt would be judged, and the idea being that you wouldn't necessarily have to know what you were doing was illegal, just that you were doing it. And the author of the bill, Senator Hughes, repeatedly used a comparison to, if I break into somebody's house, I don't necessarily need to know that burglary is a felony. I just need to know that I'm breaking into somebody's house. And I think that particular argument is probably giving some members of the lower chamber more than a little bit of concern.
Right.
Yeah, because there are instances where folks who have moved or people get confused and vote incorrectly, in the process voted legally, and that was not their intention. If you put a law on the books making it a felony and don't really clarify those situations, you don't have a lot of cases like the Crystal Mason case in Fort Worth and other cases where you get prosecuted for making a mistake.
Well, just like with anything, the devil is in the details, right? Also, in election bills, we had asked about online voter registration, which, as you know, has been brought up probably for at least the last decade. 71% of Texans support online voter registration for all eligible Texans. Is this going to go anywhere this session?
I doubt it. And the main reason that I doubt it is because the trend with election bills in Texas going back several sessions has been to err on the side of reducing the risk of quote unquote fraud. And in line with that, there has been a strong resistance to any sort of elections innovation that could make it easier to vote. I think online voting falls squarely into that. Online registration falls squarely into that category. So I don't see that as happening this session, regardless of the public sentiment in favor of it.
Not in the era of Donald Trump.
Well, with that, we'll go ahead and move away from election bills. We do have a few audience questions, and I believe we have a little bit of time to address them. What's on the table to expand quality health care to more Texans?
Well, one of the things, I mean, it's difficult because, you know, the big thing that I think maybe your reader was intending is like Medicaid expansion, which is not going to happen. It's not even really on the table. But with our abortion question from earlier, one of the things that Republicans in state office have pushed is, well, we've gotten rid of abortion. Now it's time to take care of these moms and these children. And one of those things is Medicaid expansion or an extension of Medicaid for low-income moms who have, high maternal mortality rates. And so that is a bill that passed last session. The House had it at 12 months. And then the Senate brought it back down to 6 months. There was no real explanation, I don't think, about why they brought it back to 6 months. That change, I don't think, was actually ever made because we were under these COVID-19 rules, and the federal government sort of slammed Texas for not expanding it further. So it's on the table again. The House has passed it. It's a priority for Speaker Phelan. And we'll see what happens in the Senate. But that is, I think, one clear opportunity to help low-income moms and their kids.
Okay. If passed, how will schools navigate displaying the 10 Commandments in classrooms without addressing religion?
I think that's probably the next issue that the legislature is trying to push. I mean, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has said on more than one occasion that he thinks that ought not to be a restriction that schools should be quote unquote burdened by. And I think going back to what several of my colleagues on the panel basically mentioned, they're hoping that if it comes to a test case, and it certainly would, that there is now a friendly majority on the Supreme Court that could basically enshrine the issue, not just in state statute, but a nationwide precedent.
And even if it doesn't go that far, obviously this can be an issue that's used during the primaries, during the election next year, which of course can be said for a number of the things that we talked about today. Our final question is, what's the most notable public education policy to watch? Of course, we've talked about school choice, but is there anything else in the realm of public education?
Maybe how much money, I mean, it's always money put into public education this session, teacher raises, things like that, sort of what's done to bolster public schools instead of voucher type programs.
Yeah, you can't forget the cost of living adjustments for retired teachers, and then, as you're pointing out, Cromer, the retention effort for teachers.
And just to bring this back full circle, the whole issue of property taxes does hinge on school districts themselves. So you can't really tinker with the one without affecting the other.
That's right. Well, with that, guys, I want to thank you all for joining us. James, Caleb, Gromer, and Andrew. I hope you will come back, perhaps either after the session or in November. I know not everyone has municipal elections, but we do here in this little place called Houston, and which generally can have some repercussions beyond just the Houston area. So, for everyone, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more information on upcoming hobby hour shows starting back in the fall. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you all.
It's been a pleasure.